So should I sit down?
Yeah, you just sit like this.
And my glasses are where?
There. With the sunglasses. Okay, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Ulf Sverdrup. It's a pleasure to welcome you, so many of you here today, to this seminar, Russia, the EU, and Ukraine, 2 tracks and no end. In particular, I would like to also say welcome to our friends from Estonia and another colleague also from Romania visiting the Nobel Institute. So thank you very much to all of you for joining us. Before I give the floor to our excellent speaker today, just like to inform you that this is part of the Europe seminar series that we have at NUPI. It's sponsored by the Norwegian Ministry of Foreign Affairs. It's also part of our EU-NOR research project sponsored by the Norwegian Research Council. And this, we have a series of seminars, and in a few weeks' time, we will have a seminar also on TTIP. So you're welcome back. Just let me also take this opportunity to inform you or warn you that this seminar, we stream our seminars. So if you don't mind, you should be aware that this session will be somehow recorded. Today, the focus is on Russia, the EU and Ukraine, and with a special focus on how the EU and European countries are handling the crisis and the running up to the crisis. For years, the European Union did not have a proper policy as such vis-à-vis Russia, apart from a policy of modernization. But in the aftermath of Crimea and the developments in Ukraine, Europe is put to a serious test, and Europe needs to develop a new policy. And what we have seen so far is that Germany and France are taking the leadership, but there are very different views and perspectives in Europe on how to move on. So far, we have seen a 2-track policy of, on the one hand, sanctions, and but at the same time, attempts at finding some way of engagement and dialogue. On the ground, we observe that the Minsk II agreement, the peace agreement, is partially respected, but still very fragile. We also note that in Ukraine, the economy is deteriorating further. And we note that the general relationship between the West and Russia is in a bad shape. And although there have been some attempts recently to engage in discussions. And in this seminar today, we will discuss how the European policies have evolved, and we will discuss its achievements and its sustainability. And we are very fortunate to have one of the leading European experts with us today, Anne-Marie le Gloannec. Anne-Marie is a senior research fellow at CERI, SciencesPo in Paris. But she's a Norwegian these days. She's a resident fellow at the Nobel Institute. She has written extensively on various topics on European international affairs and Europe's role in the world. And she's just about to complete a book on European Union as a regional power, continent by default, the European Union, the Continental Order, and the return of power politics. So on this note, please, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you first for your very kind words, and thank you very much for the invitation. It's really a pleasure being here in Oslo, being invited by the Nobel Institute, being able to come here at NUPI, because being at the Nobel Institute allows me to come here and to address these assistants, including some of my colleagues here. Thank you. What I'm going to do is try to put the conflict between the EU / it will be only / the EU / member states, the conflict between the EU / member states and Russia over Ukraine within a broader context. I am going to analyze the title very, very briefly. EU, Russia, Ukraine. When I say EU in the title, I will mean always, and I will look at greater details in greater details at the policy of some member states, or we can also in this discussion talk about it more in greater details. I do not assume that there is an EU policy and that we might treat the EU and Russia as two entities, as it is sometimes done in the literature. Actually, foreign policy is still very much in the remit of national states. It is written in the Lisbon Treaty, among other things, in spite of the facts that member states should show solidarity between one another, and that they have developed some institutions that we know of. But on the whole, we have national foreign policies. And we have what I call constellations of national foreign policies. Constellations meaning that they are sometimes alignment of foreign policies, like alignment of stars according to governments in power, according to interests. There are some political culture, particular political culture, playing an important role in this background. Various interests, including companies. So we see that it's a very, very specific and particular and complex multi-level system of foreign policies, including sometimes some policies of national states are at loggerheads with one another. The second part of the question, of course, of the title is the subliminal question is the Ukrainian conflict susceptible to find an end? Is there a solution feasible, possible in some foreseeable time? What I'm going to do is proceed in two ways, which in two times, two steps, very SciencesPo-like, two steps. First step, I would like to look at the background of EU/member states Russia relations. And by background, I mean the 24 years which have elapsed since the fall of the wall, which fall more or less into two, the first decade and then the second decade, though there are overlap and continuities, and the continuities between the 1990s and the years 2000 are certainly not to be glossed over. And in the second part, I will focus more on 2014 as a watershed in the Continental Order, in what I call the Continental Order in international law, in the Continental Order as it was shaped not only by the fall of the wall and subsequent treaties and agreements and commitments, but even by Cold War agreements like the famous Helsinki Final Act of 1975, according to which borders should not be violated or by force violated. I mean, it reiterated. So this is the these are the two steps. So let's look first at the time too, and at the what I call the 20-year transition. I know transition doesn't mean anything, but I have not found any better a title so far. So first point, the time frame, the rationale, the instruments. From the early 1990s till the early years of 2000, I would roughly, like most people, say 2004 being more or less a turning point, or a turning point, maybe not, but a symbolizing an evolution from the first decade towards the second decade. I mean, having in mind domestic evolutions, Beslan and Khodorkovsky, these kinds of elements. The rationale in the 1990s and the early years of 2000 was the following as far as the EU and the individual member states were concerned. They were assuming, surmising, thinking that Russia was, as I call it, a bigger Poland. Bigger, that is to say, both more difficult and more promising. It would take a long way, it would be a convoluted evolution, but in the end result, we would have a democratic free market economy. Problems, but big perspectives. So that was the rationale that you find in a number of texts and talks. The procedures or the instruments, let's call them. The instruments actually were copy-pasted from enlargement. No original thinking, which actually, parenthesis, really also was the case in as far as NATO was concerned, steps by step, ratcheting up previous offers. Here you had a copy-paste from enlargement, the signature of the PCA, the Partnership and Cooperation Agreement of 1994, implemented in 1997. A little footnote on that later. What did I write here? Then yes, the offer of an ENP. The ENP, the European Neighborhood Policy, was offered to Russia, which I think was a very big diplomatic blunder from the part of the Europeans. If you are a Russian, you consider that the EU is a neighborhood and a neighbor and not vice versa. So, but eventually the four spaces, which were agreed upon in St. Petersburg in 2004, the watershed, were copy-pasted from ENP, which is very interesting. And actually, also parenthesis, Russia received money from ENP, even not being a member and not wanting to be a member of ENP. The most original, maybe, of these copy-paste formulas borrowed from enlargement was TASIS, technical agreement to the community of independent states, involving money, etc., but it was devolved to the regions, cooperations between cities and regions, between EU member states and Russia. It was sort of interesting. I mean, quite an interesting approach to try to address civil society, but at the same time, when you consider the vastness of Russia and the limited resources of ENP, of the EU and the Commission, this meant that this was not going to go very far. At the same time, so you had the rationale of the EU, of the Commission, but at the same time you had, from the part of member states, within the Council or outside the Council individually, and I'm going to distinguish both, because they behave in different ways, interestingly enough, when they're in Brussels and when they are back in their capital cities. There were attempts at devising strategies. You remember 1990s, that was the buzzword for the EU, devising strategies, right? We need strategies. So the first strategy ever devised was for Russia, and it came down to very little. Some experts have defined it as a Christmas tree. You hang very many little things, or it's a catalog, but you don't get anywhere with that. And at the same time, this strategy or attempt at devising a strategy was taken over by the individual states and, in particular, the French and the Germans, or I would say the Germans and the French. That would be much more correct, more realistic. A Berlin-Paris Moscow axis, which came to fruition in particular in 2004, 2005, I think 2005, the 9th of May 2005, which probably rings a bell with the Estonian here, and when I think it was the Lithuanian president who agreed to go to these celebrations, but was very outspoken. But in any case, Jacques Chirac and Gerhard Schröder were very prominently there and tried to forge this Berlin-Paris Moscow axis, which didn't boil much more to as a other triangle to much more than a symbolism, but in terms of bilateral relations was prominent in particular regarding German Russian corporations, see Nord Stream and the agreement to build Nord Stream, which was agreed upon in 2005 between Gerhard Schröder and Vladimir Putin. So this is the 1990s. To turn over to the 2004-14, so we had another decade or whatever, starting after the four spaces copy-pasted from enlargement. The rationale again, what was the rationale? I mean, there was a perception, of course, in the EU, in capital cities, in Brussels, that things were not going all very well, and that engagement had to take place, that there was a necessity to be more forthcoming, not to be treating the Russians or the Russian leadership as a bigger Polish leadership or as a partner, certainly, but on whom one could impose values and pretend that there would be common values, but to try to engage in a new way. And the formula or the slogan which came forth was partnership through modernization. This was the instrument, the procedure. And partnership through modernization was a German invention, very interestingly enough. Coming from various strands, coming from Peter the Great, from the 1960s, which totally failed, from the slogan which was used in Germany, if I remember correctly, was, will I remember? Annäherung durch Verpflichtung, meaning rapprochement through cooperation, which was, again, copy-pasted from Wandel durch Annäherung, change through rapprochement, the famous slogan of Ostpolitik, policy vis-à-vis the East, invented in the 1960s, coined by Egon Bahr, taken over by Willy Brandt, and applied to German, Russian, and Western EU relations. So there were lots of echoes there. The German rationale was, let's engage, let's modernize. If we modernize, we will have an increasing sector of rule of law, at least in companies, in certain kind of areas. And the dots were, I mean, it was a non-spoken, but unspokenly probably that might have some spillover, right? But this was never spelled out for fear of sounding like regime change. So the Germans had a very specific role, and I remember talking to somebody from the MOD in France saying, the Germans connect the dots. We do have the dots too, but we don't connect, they do. The Germans coined the formula, and the Europeans, the Commission, took it over in 2009. Rostov on the Don, that was the blueprint taken over from Germany. We can go back to Germany later in the discussion. So that was the first point concerning this background. The second point concerning this background is, I call it Who Lost Russia? I'm going to try to be brief. If I don't want to get too carried away, I think it's probably speak a lot. Who lost Russia? If Russia was ever lost, of course, there is a question mark. The myth of broken promises. I call it, it's the West stupid. No, it's not the West stupid. The West did made mistakes. Unilateral actions from Kosovo to Libya. We can have a discussion on that too later, including Iraq, including shooting oneself in the foot in the years 2000 with the financial crisis in the United States and all the economic, financial, political, monetary, whatever you want. In the European Union, yes, we did, but there were no broken promises in the sense that there was absolutely never, ever any promise not to extend NATO. I mean, there's been a controversy in the West, none in Russia, that's interesting, in the West, but I mean, from Gorbachev to George Bush father to Bob Zerlich to very many, I mean, this is fairly well documented that there was no promise, and let alone for the reason that the Warsaw Pact was still existing at the time. What was done at the time, which is worth underlying because we are getting to the asymmetry of the structure of the relations at the time, is a tale of two worlds, different rules. The West opened the doors to many, the West, this time Americans, Europeans, opened the door to many institutions to Russia, sometimes before Russia delivered. A very good example is the Council of Europe. We opened the door, Russia entered and never delivered. I mean, the heap of complaints by Russian citizens is the greatest next to the number of complaints raised by Turkish citizens. We could quote WTO, of course, where the Russian authorities have been the worst offenders. But relations with NATO, with the NATO-Russian Council, the steps aforementioned concerning the EU, so many doors were opened. So now we could say very well, these were Western institutions, Western imprinted institutions, hence an asymmetry. And yes, that was right. They were Western institutions that were open to the East, to Russia, and that Russia grudgingly or willingly accepted. A little bit, you can compare that to West Germany, East Germany. West German institutions, no East German institutions. East Germans wanted or accepted Western institutions. Russia or Russian authorities with Kremlin put offers on the table to have a European house, but very late. Look at 2008, we have had a discussion on that with Adrian the other day concerning a military, a security system it was an offer made by Medvedev before the Georgia War and after the Georgia War security system. There was an energy project put forth by Vladimir Putin as an echo to the energy charter that they never ratified and got out of. There was also an echo made to an FTA, a free trade agreement from Lisbon to Vladivostok. Can't remember the date. It's somewhere in my papers, probably 2010 or 2012. But these dates, these were very late. This was not in the 1990s. These were not in the first Putin administration, right? And second, these plans were always extremely vague, and especially the free trade agreement was a kind of slap in the face of the Europeans saying, oh, the energy European Union is going to spoil the whole continent. What we want is a free trade agreement. And that was it. No other proposal. So eventually, different rules, different structures, and asymmetry. A fundamental asymmetry between Russia and the EU, which is actually even more than an asymmetry. It is a series of asymmetries. Asymmetries within asymmetries, but Russian dolls, but they are not compensating one another. We have very asymmetrical relations between the EU member states, EU companies on the one hand, and the Kremlin and Gazprom on the other, just to take one example that is of interest to you, if I understand. Whereby I'm going to be just mention two things. The Gazprom has gradually brought very many assets in Europe up to Western Europe, upstream, midstream, downstream hubs, sometimes murky deals, very interesting. I had a very nice conversation with a former foreign minister in Hungary who told me about an exchange of shares which was known from the government itself between OMV, as it's called now, OMV, and and Gazprom. Interesting. And the second point is, so there was a very systematic kind of, it's much more difficult to buy into and to invest in Russia. Whereas, and the second point here is that Gazprom serves the interest of the Kremlin or Kremlin's friends. There are very good studies, in particular by Vladimir Milov and his former, or is then co-author assassinated in between Boris Nemtsov. What I call a game of musical shares, whereby shares go from Gazprom to some people, etc. So you have a very asymmetrical relation. Here you have an asymmetrical relation between EU institutions and member states, as I indicated earlier. And as you know, and I'm going not to explain that, have good or bad relations with Russia. There is this famous paper which was published in 2007 by what's his name, Mark Leonard and Nicu Popescu, which is, I think, far too complicated. I think they have got 8 models of going from Cyprus, which I really like as a pun, to very friendly to cold warriors. There is the other too simple distinction between East and West. I like personally to make a distinction between a northern principled, what I call principled tier, from sometimes the UK, Sweden, I don't know where I put Norway, probably there, I don't know. The Baltic countries, of course, and Poland. And a southern tier that Churchill called in different circumstances the soft belly of Europe, which would include Italy and Greece and who else? Cyprus, of course, and Bulgaria, Hungary, of course, and not Romania. So Hungary, certainly, current Hungary, Orban's Hungary. And Orban, there is less than 50% of people voting for Orban. I mean, according to votes, less than 50% go to votes, anyway. And you have a middle tier with the French and the Germans as a pivot. We'll come back to this a little bit later. And finally, on this question of asymmetry, of course, the asymmetry between the nature of the Russian regime and the nature, and of course the nature of the EU and the member states, or most of them, I hope, and also the nature of Russia with its surroundings. And here I say Russia, and I say not only the Kremlin, and I stress here the importance of looking at the continuities since the 1990s that we tend sometimes to gloss over, because ever since the demise of the Soviet Union Russia has had a lot of difficulties to shed the remnants of its empires, stressing its own sovereignty, but certainly not willing to recognize the sovereignty of small neighboring states on whom they have put massive pressures in many ways, including embargoes, including etc. And this is linked. The two things are linked between the nature of the regime and the surroundings. The policy of the Kremlin vis-à-vis the smaller countries and the West, and because there is the theme which has been explained a lot, underlined a lot. I mean, that I'm just taking over from those who know Russia and Russian critics, Western experts, the theme of the besieged fortress, right, which helps consolidate the vertical of power in the hands of one man. And now I'm turning to the second part, Ukraine, a strategy and no end. And I think the first part was important to see that we have a major problem on our hand, because we really, as I said it at one point of time, a tale of two worlds. What I call in my hopefully soon forthcoming book, battle of words in a battle of worlds. No clash of civilization, please. So, Ukraine. What did I write here? Yeah, the assumptions that the West had, the EU in this time, the EU and EU member states, on Russia and Ukraine, on Russia's policies and reactions, on Ukraine's policies and reactions. And in particular, I would say the lack of, I mean, there were some fairly good analysis which were made at the time. I was sent a paper this morning by a friend from Stefan Fühle, written in September 1913, so Commissioner for Enlargement.
2013.
So, what do you say?
You said 1913.
Of course. Wow. 2013, days of yesterday. Quite an insightful paper, under the, published by the Commission. I mean, totally official paper, really stressing the fact that there were different policies, that there were different approaches, that the Russian authorities were putting heavy pressures on Ukraine, and that this was totally unacceptable and from the part of the EU. But at the same time, what I find difficult to understand is how neither the Commission nor the EU member states, as far as I know, again, restriction here, as far as I know, really foresaw the possible reaction by the Kremlin authorities and their policy, their reaction towards the EU and the EU member states. After all, the negotiation of an upgrade in EU-Ukrainian relations had started very early on, since the Orange Revolution. When the Orange Revolution took place in 2004, we in the EU thought, well, I take myself as a European, the people in the EU thought, well, we should have a different kind of offer, put a different kind of offer on the table, different from what we had done with Leonid Kuchma. This new government should have something better to offer its population. So that this had been discussed for a while. Ukraine joined WTO in 2008, which opened the door towards the negotiations, which were started in 2012. And for that, all those years, till 2013, there was no reaction from the part of Russian authorities regarding the consequences of a DCFTA, a deep and comprehensive trade agreement, within an association agreement between the EU and Ukraine, and the consequences this would have on Russia-Ukraine relations and the incipient Russian Eurasian Union, which was going to take place, to be hammered out in 2015. So there were from the part of the Commission, two arguments. The first one was to say there will be problems, certainly technical problems, between EU, Ukraine and this DCFTA on the one hand, between Ukraine and Russia and their free trade area within the Eurasian Economic Union. Technical problems because of differences in tariff barriers, but these can be technically dealt with. What is the real problem behind is that there are different types of approaches. The Russians want to impose their conditions. This was the text of Fühle in September 2013. But nothing was really thought about. I don't mean by this that the EU should have withdrawn its proposal or even offered already a dialogue with Russia, but at least thought, well, if they do this, we should do that. Then what is the next step? You know, maybe we could have borrowed Magnus Carlsen. That might have been quite useful. Let's make a little pause here. So the problem was well seen, but at the same time not translated into strategic terms. And in that very paper I was quoting by Fühle, and I had seen that quote earlier, he says specifically, I don't want to go into into strategic politics. I don't want to be dragged into a strategic game. And that I think it speaks volume about the Commission, but on the part of the Council, there was no response either. From the part of the Member States, there was no strategic thinking either. And when you were talking to people in November 2013, when you made interviews, read articles by experts, etc., very many people, the vast majority of people were expecting that Ukraine would actually sign the association agreement in Vilnius in December. Which leads me to the second assumption or series of thoughts behind this. What is it? What do we think? What is the analysis that we make in the West, or that is often made about Ukraine and Russia, coming from, by the way, from different people? The notion of cradle, the ties, for instance. I don't exactly remember the date, but I think probably in 2011 or maybe 2012, in those years, there was a meeting in Sevastopol, I think, with both Viktor Yanukovych and Vladimir Putin. And Vladimir Putin saying, with Yanukovych standing by, you know, praising the blood ties with tears in his eyes, and Yanukovych was standing very stern and not very happy about the discussion. I mean, the body language is quite interesting. When we look at Ukrainian policy vis-à-vis Russia in all these years, we see that it was not particularly keen to get into the Eurasian Economic Union and later Eurasian Union. So cradles, ties. Public opinion. Well, I will just evoke the public opinion polls which have been published before the invasion of Crimea and after by the Razumkov Center in Kiev. Before the invasion of Crimea, public opinion in Ukraine was definitely in favor of Ukrainians' independence. Economic ties. There is an assumption here that economic ties do matter. Gas, certainly, Ukraine has a transit way, though there has been attempts to avoid this way. The importance of gas of the Crimea Peninsula has been also stressed. But if you add up all these things and imagine that you have a democratic government in power in Kiev, in Moscow, then all these kind of arguments could be spelled out very differently. There could be very normal relations from state to state, between sovereign states, like they are between Norway and Sweden, and Norway and Denmark, and France and Germany, for instance, right? So the very important piece which is missing so far, which I'm going to spell it out, is of course the importance of democracy failing in Ukraine, the importance of having a state which is either a failed state or a non-democratic state. Under the and the rationale would be, well, if the EU can't have it, If we Russians can't have it, the EU will not have it either. If we accept that as a major hypothesis, then Mariupol doesn't matter. Then there can be very well a lull in fightings for quite a while. This is not what matters, actually. There may be a lull in fighting and a sort of respect of Minsk too, because it might lead to less sanctions, at least some parts of the sanctions. I will come back to this later. But there will be no end, because what is primary is the importance of not having a democratic state such as Ukraine. So third and final point of this second part, is there a Western answer? Has there been a EU answer? Is there a coherent European answer? And what is this answer all about? I call it a double-track approach, reminding again it's very German, because it's very German, it's very much Germany imprinted. I want to recall the Armel report of 1967, the Armel report, which was very much German imprinted. Rearmament on the one hand, visit the Soviet Union, then at least rearmament. Sorry, couldn't help. And on the other hand, talking. So tough and talk. And here it's the same. We have the double track. On the one hand, and I will start with the talks, a dialogue has been dragging on, including the two Minsk agreement of September last year and February this year, the last one being very bizarre. We can discuss that a little bit later. I think it really underlines goes in the way of the failed state option. The opening of trilateral talks to have Russia, Ukraine, and the EU discussing both DCFTA, Deep and Comprehensive Free Trade Agreement, and Free Trade Area. Chancellor Merkel's offer in Davos in January to conclude a free trade agreement with Russia. Again, the offer that was made, or the reference that was made by Vladimir Putin a few years ago. She's quoted to have said, Europe should not give up on European Russia. On the other hand, sanctions has been taken. As you know, 3 sets of sanctions that I'm not going to go through in March, in July, in several steps, and each time reinforced. What is the point of sanctions now? What is the point of sanctions? If you look at the impact of sanctions on the Russian governments and the tie between the Russian authorities and the population, it's not going anywhere. Well, of course, there are these economic difficulties, but it's linked with the fall of the ruble, it's linked with the problem of energy, it's linked with the extremely skewed economy. It's very difficult to prove that it's sanction alone that are having such a short time influence. Such an influence in the short term. In the long run, they may, if it's very difficult for Russian energy companies to access technology. In the midterm, they may, because of refinancing the debt of big companies on the market. But still, to isolate one variable from the other. In any case, it is not changing the political behavior of the Kremlin, and it's reinforcing the according to the Levada Center and a number of polls taken by the Levada Center, reinforcing the standing of Vladimir Putin among the population, and B, the idea among the populations that the EU wants to get at the Russian population, right? That sanctions are targeting the population, which is exactly what the EU is trying not to do. Also, I want to underline here, I'll be very brief and then go back to the point of the sanctions, very brief, it's the first time really that the European Union really does big sanctions regarding a big state. Sanctions regarding a big state, 89 China, very little, relatively little, and in any kind resigned a year later. 1994, first war against Chechnya, sanctions against Russia, well, just the suspension of the PCA I was mentioning earlier, which was implemented in 1997. 2008, and the war against Georgia, Bernard Kouchner, French foreign minister, France being head of the rotating presidency at the time, there is no question of sanctions. We're not going to do sanctions. So this is the first time we do sanctions, right? And relatively tough. But they don't have any influence. So what's the purpose of these sanctions? And I would say to some extent, the purpose is twofold. Or it's a mix of related purposes. Business as usual is not possible. 2014 is a watershed. It's, as I said, the end of the post-Cold War and even Cold War commitments. It's infringement upon international relations and in the international order as it exists in Europe. It is a major infringement that cannot be just glossed over by the European Union and the member states. Second is, can we do anything militarily? No way. I mean, I'm not going to enter that. It's partly also the topic of my book. It's we don't do wars. We do small military interventions, but we don't do wars. And there is this nice expression, if there was anything military, EU military, it died in the dunes of Libya during the intervention, which was purely made purely by individual states. So it would be the only relatively robust kind of instruments we have. Second, it is also a way to try to get some coherence between European states. And this is also where dialogue and sanctions are important. I mean, to try to find a certain kind of coherence, and so far we have managed. When you talk to people who are relatively familiar with Minsk II, which is, to me, a little bit awkward, because I think very many things have been given the Russian authorities and Russian-supported rebels rather than Kiev. Why Minsk II? Again, trying to square the circle of the various opinions, peer pressuring, the names I mentioned earlier, in particular the Hungarians, Italians, Greeks, Cypriots, Republic of Cyprus. So it's an attempt really to square the circle and to define a relatively coherent policy, which Angela Merkel is doing fairly well. She's doing in the Council and with the heads of states and governments individually what she's doing with people in Berlin, you know, meeting them individually and having, I don't know how she does. I mean, she must be amazing. I heard somebody who knows the background relatively well saying she has people eating from her hand. I mean, very, very powerful in persuading, and maybe sometimes using, I don't know if she coerces, but she has probably tough elements of persuasion. In any way, I think from all this you gather that the conflict is there to go. I wouldn't call it a frozen conflict. I hate the expression frozen conflict, because frozen conflicts mean that the situation is evolving on the ground and facts are made, are created, and are going on, and it's very difficult to undo them. Look at what Abkhazia, which is now South Ossetia, is already gone. South Ossetia, Georgia is part of Russia, but Abkhazia has been now incorporated. Look at Transnistria and the way it is being used by Gazprom to finance. I mean, the operation. This is being very well analyzed by Nicu Popescu and one of his co-writer, I can't remember his name, analyzing the way Gazprom is using the whole system to self-finance and to finance Russian companies and friends of the regime. That's very interesting. So it's the tail wagging the dog. And in the case of Ukraine, we will have a tail, even more than the tail wagging the dog. I think it's more like having the bulk of Ukraine, the Kievan regime, bleeding gradually, losing, blood, trying to send troops and whatever, and money. I mean, they're supposed with Minsk II to go on financing pensions and whatever. I mean, and just spending time and money and strength in entertaining an area that is gone in a way. So it's a way of exerting pressure on Ukraine, but to maintain it in a particular situation which might prevent, I will not say will, but might prevent it from really turning to essential reforms in the country. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Now, I suggested we open the floor for questions. You brought up a lot of issues, very interesting issues, and there are lots of competent people in the room here today. So, just open the floor, and please raise your hand and please indicate your name and affiliation, if you have any. Ola Thunander, please.
Yeah, thank you very much for an interesting lecture. And I was wondering...
Excuse me.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
My name is Ola Thunander, and I'm from the Peace Research Institute.
Yeah, and I know your name, yes.
Yes. So I wonder if you go back to 1990 and these years, you described it at the time as that it was a general agreement that the NATO enlargement and so on was never, that one was never against that on the Russian side and so on. I don't think that's true. I mean, I think Gorbachev has expressed very clearly afterwards that he was very much against, and Primakov said that they were, fooled actually, and also Jack Matlock, the American ambassador and so on, said that, and Genscher also actually. So but it was clear that it was not in the papers. It was not in any kind of written agreement, but it was a general understanding that that was the case. And I think also that the Russian side, I mean, they were. Is something going on here? Yes. Yeah, sorry. So that's, but there was also, at 91, Burbulis and Gaidar and Kozyrev and so on wrote a letter to Yeltsin saying that we cannot keep the Baltic republics, may not be able to keep Ukraine and Georgia, better get rid of all of it, because we cannot sit there with Central Asia. So it's because that's authoritarian and so on. So that the idea was that if you do that, you become president, and then you could join the European institutions. And that didn't happen. In '92, Yeltsin called Manfred Werner and said, when could we become member of NATO? And Manfred Werner, of course, couldn't say anything. So so I think the background is a little bit different from what you're told, actually.
Would you like to respond to this?
I was. It was just a little piece of my expansive talk, and I said there was a debate in the West. So I am quite aware of that, and that there are two camps. But actually, when you look at who is saying what, I mean, even Gorbachev, in his memoirs, also says that it was not in the picture because of the Warsaw Pact, etc. So that couldn't be discussed at the time. It was an assumption more than anything else. And then when you talked again, as I said, or talk or read Bush and Zulik, and I have all these quotes in my book, which is here, among other things. I mean, so you have the ambassadors and some foreign ministers, and you have heads of states and government and some other foreign advisors who are of a different opinion. The context being that the Warsaw Pact was still existing. Now, the question behind this is, would you rather say, or would you rather consider Russia opposing NATO enlargement, or take the right of smaller states of the in-between into consideration, the right to choose where they want to belong? And I happen to belong to the second category. I think that's it. I mean, sovereignty. If the Estonia or Romania wanted to join, yes, why not? I don't see any reason why. And now, the situation concerning Ukraine is very difficult, but I would say as long as there is a conflict with some unclear help from others in this country, nothing should be discussed. Once Ukraine regains its full independence, there might be a discussion, because apparently it's a real matter of conflict, yes. But it's not a, I mitigate the right to decide one's own future with the fact that there is a conflict which has been going on, which is going on, but only once the conflict has been settled.
Okay, thank you so much. And then,
Faruk Uziv, I'm an intern here from OSCE Academy in Bishkek, Kyrgyzstan. We're doing internship here with a few other guys. I appreciate your insightful talk, in which you, interestingly enough, avoided the organization I'm remotely associated with, namely OSCE. And I was wondering what your opinion is about the possibilities of using this space for contestation or negotiation with Russia, of which it is a member, as we know. We have been involved in several discussions that involved CSTO people and a few Russian officials, and as well as OSCE representatives. And it seems that this organization has a luxury of not having an explicit position on Ukraine or any other matter. And I was just wondering if you could share your opinion about the organization's use or misuse in this process. Thanks a lot.
Or little use and misuse. That's how I would put it. When you look at the history of OSCE in the Caucasus, for instance, it has been extremely limited, and eventually it was its mandate was not reconduced. I think in 2005, was it, in Georgia, which was 3 years before the conflict took place, or the war took place, because the conflict was ongoing, right? So it didn't play a major role, and at one point of time, its mandate was rescinded by the Russian authorities. In Donbass, its mandate is clear according to the Minsk agreement, but at the same time, the capacity to act on the ground is very limited. It's little in terms of number. I don't have the numbers in head. I mean, how can it really survey the border? How can it survey what is happening in the country? So I wish it were more robust in terms of not necessarily of mandate, but in terms of manpower to be able to really be on the ground in most places or in everywhere, but it's not the case. So I don't think it's going to play a particular role.
Noran Ripsman from Concordia University in Montreal, Canada, also one of Anne-Marie's co-fellows at the Nobel Institute this summer. Anne-Marie, thank you very much for a fantastic talk. You've told a story about EU-Russian relations over the last number of years with very little mention of my neighbor down south, the United States. In particular, there's a story to be told, there's an argument to be made that what really has affected the last number of years was the fact that you had an Obama administration that was economically constrained, domestically constrained, and in particular, unwilling to project power internationally. And I'm wondering if you could talk about that, whether that's a fair assessment of how that affected both Ukraine and, Ukraine, EU, and Russia in the process, and whether that's a significant part of the tale, or whether that's rather a North American view that's at odds with events.
First, a general remark. Generally speaking, your remark is absolutely well taken. In the sense that I speak too little about U.S.-EU the EU-U.S. connection within that broader context, which would require volumes of, in terms of talk now, in terms of book, etc., etc. But the discussion we had previously concerning the broken promises, of course, I mean, there is the whole American background there, right? Now, if we look specifically, I'm trying to try to think quickly or not. Well, that's difficult. In the past 5 years, if we had any differences, the reset, the absence of reset, has it made any difference? I'm trying to think I'm thinking loudly. It may make a difference in the sense that, hypothesis, right, that Russian authorities may have, on the continent, shifted their attention from the United States to the EU. The EU has, in Russian perspective, has gone sort of ups and downs. At the beginning of the years 2000, it was all written big in Russian literature. The Russian embassy in Brussels was suddenly blooming. It was the most important. I think it's still the most important. In Brussels, you had, and why actually? It was because of the remarkable work that the Commission did when negotiating a Lithuania enlargement and the question of relationship between Kaliningrad and Russian territory proper. I'm using Georgian vocabulary now, and Russian territory proper, right? So they did a remarkable job because this was their job to do that, enlargement, right? So there was, within this context, this idea that the EU was mattering, and then after it sort of went down, and there was George W. Bush and all the constellation shifting towards Central Asia and through the Caucasus, and then back to Europe, and back to Europe, I think it's more a matter of coincidence. On the one hand, you have the Eastern Partnership, which is a better version, a ratcheted up version of European neighborhood policy, which was an improved offer from the EU to the Eastern European states. Right, what's the date? 2009, I think. Is that correct? 2009, and start and DCFTA with deep and free trade agreement and association agreement with Ukraine, Moldova. Should have spoken of Moldova and Georgia, etc. At the same time, relations with the United States were not improving. The reset was not going anywhere, and the president may have been perceived as leading from behind, maybe. Now, you have to put into the equation NATO if something happens, because so this is the negative negative side, or the weak side. But what you have, I mean, we have currently sanctions, the United States together with Europe. I mean, both are doing them together. I didn't mention that. But also the military reinforcement has been done both through NATO and through the United States. In Eastern Europe, you had the Cornwall Agreement in September last year. Poland didn't get all it wanted. It got a rapid reaction force, but which is not stationed in Poland as Foreign Minister Sikorski wanted. It's stationed elsewhere. I don't know where it's stationed, but it can come fairly quickly. And you have a turnover, a rotation, probably. I'm sure you know better than I do on that. In Estonia in particular, yeah, 500? 500, but is it bilateral or is it NATO? It's NATO. And then you have the bilateral agreement between Romania and the United States. This is all what I know of. But this has been sort of growing up, right? So, and I think that it's a major component in the background of this EU policy I was mentioning. I mean, the EU does what it does, sanctions, which I think, I mean, if we're not doing any sanction, that would be terrible. I mean, we must do sanctions, right, even symbolically. It's not big business as usual. But fortunately, there are these NATO and bilateral US individual member states steps which are being made. Now, I'm just going to be a little bit pessimistic, which is the Adrian Bradshaw scenario. Adrian Bradshaw being Deputy Commander-in-Chief of Deputy Supreme Allied Commander in Europe, British. And he held a talk a few months ago at Chatham House, but not Chatham House rules. I mean, this was public. I mean, this was the excerpts were made public, saying that there might be not only a hybrid war that we were talking about yesterday. I mean, these little green men, but that there might be a conventional grab, quick in and out, that might be taken seriously into consideration, and that maybe people in this country know also of. So just to summarize, the US is always very much in the background, and I didn't mention it enough, that's for sure. And I think it does matter in terms of military as a kind of backup to EU-US sanction policy.
We might return to this, but there's another question, but let me just jump in and then we take the other. Would EU pursue sanction policy without the US sanctions? But then first.
Thank you, Ulf. Good morning. My name is Henrik Seip from Eastern Europe Group Consultancy. Thank you very much, especially for reminding us what went on in the 90s and early noughties. Mm-hmm. Memories are often short, mm-hmm. even in learned circles. My question is about what you responded to Ola Thunander as he asked the first question. Mm-hmm. And I think you misspoke because you indicated that Ukraine is not independent. Mm-hmm. Of course it's independent. It held 2 free and fair elections last year with clear outcomes. The problem with Ukraine is that its territorial sovereignty is not intact.
Yeah, I agree.
Yes, I know. I said you misspoke.
Yes, yes, I did.
The problem with Ukraine is that there's a war going on on its territory.
Yes.
Now, I recall that you began by saying, can there be peace in Ukraine? Mm-hmm. I don't believe you found the time to respond entirely to your own question. So I would like to
Okay.
Hear your opinion. Can there be peace in Ukraine? And if yes, when and how? Thank you very much.
I totally agree with you. I made a mistake. I mean, independent, but not sovereign. I think I responded actually, saying that this conflict is gonna stay. It's not going to go. I don't see any reason why. What do we call peace first? If we call peace real peace, not a semi something, not the end of weapons. Not, I can't find the word. The end of sorry, weapons been put down or a ceasefire. I mean, you don't do ceasefire anymore these days. I mean, you don't declare wars, you don't do ceasefires, you don't wear anything anymore. I mean, you don't wear military uniforms. I mean, that's gone. But if you call peace, I mean, the reestablishment of Ukrainian sovereignty, I don't see that unless we have a different regime in Moscow, because I don't see the interest of Moscow for having a different, and I say again Moscow, I don't want to talk really about Russian people. I think we should not mix up, though there are Lebada figures showing that people are behind, but anyway. But as long as we have that kind of regime, and I don't even talk of Putin, right? As long as we have that kind of regime that, as I said, I assume, has not so much grabbing territory in view as maintaining a pressure on a country to avoid reforms of any kind, including energy reforms, including murky deals, stopping the contact, the connections between oligarchs on both sides, and so on and so forth. I mean, I don't see their interest in having a peace. So that's my answer. I don't see that, and we should not accept anything at any condition. The fear is now, I mean, the in-between question is, and this is, I'm turning to you again, what was exactly your question? Because I think it follows up nicely. Yeah?
Even
Oh.
absent the US sanctions. But I guess that's the watershed argument. This is European
yeah.
sanctions without US
That's difficult because, I mean, what if the Big Brother had not been there? We live with Big Brother. I'm happy we have Big Brother, by the way, most of the time, not always, but most of the time. We must not underestimate the strength of mind of Angela Merkel. I think she really, really dislikes Vladimir Putin. And when I say dislikes, I think it's putting the thing in very many ways, because it's probably very, very both passionate but rational, right? In many ways. I mean, there are stories about her on the personal level, Putin to Putin, but I mean, I think she has said a number of times that he has broken his word. I mean, for a German, that's the end of it, right? No way. He's not going to go any further with her. Now she has to be soft on dialogue and Minsk and all these things, because she tries, because that's one of my explanations. I don't have the whole story. I'm trying to find it further. I will have more interviews that I'm determined to do. But she's trying to embrace so many different people. I mean, the most amazing thing, and really chapeau, as we would say in French, congratulations, that's absolutely amazing. She managed to have her own CEOs, those who were rushing to Moscow to pay tribute to Putin and say, oh, no, we don't want sanctions, we won't have them, etc., etc. She managed to turn them around, I mean, which is absolutely amazing, right? So she has done that with people inside. She has helped by other people, by a very important person in the Bund der Deutschen Industrie, the equivalent of the Alliance of German Industry, who is extremely pro-European, Markus Kerber, and he's quoted for having said, you know, there are things which are much more important than interests, which is fantastic, and she's doing it at the EU level. The problem is one of them going to back down? That's the problem. Is one of them at one point of time is name names? Is Orban? Is whomever? Tsipras going at one point in time going to say no? I don't know.
Okay, please, over here, and then there's here. Sorry, so we have 3 questions, we just collect.
Okay.
Sofia Balanchuadze, First Secretary of the Georgian Embassy. Thank you for a very interesting presentation. And I would like to make a small comment about one point that you mentioned. You mentioned South Ossetia, that it's already part of Russia.
Yeah.
And I would like to comment on this because, unfortunately, the Treaty on Alliance and Integration was signed in November last year with Abkhazia region and between Abkhazia and Russia, and later in March of this year between Russia and South Ossetia. But we as Georgians and the whole international society doesn't consider these treaties legal. So if we say and if we consider that South Ossetia is already part of Russia, I think that's what Russia wants, and it won't be.
Okay, it was a quick way of expressing myself. I'm sorry for that.
Yes,
No, I happen to have spent some time in Tbilisi. By the way, it's absolutely fantastic for Russians to be staying in South Ossetia. 80 kilometers, isn't it? 80 kilometers from Tbilisi. I mean, that's a means of pressure, if you call it. You know, it's absolutely fantastic. So, but what I was meaning in terms of fact, you know, that's what I was meaning by this. I mean, you cannot enter South Ossetia. There are some people from different NGOs, as you know very well, who have entered Abkhazia. That's feasible. But I agree with you, we should not recognize it. Same thing as we did with the Baltic countries for all the interwar period. We should never, ever recognize these countries. But that's a fantastic weapon in the arms of the Russian authorities.
Unfortunately, but we still consider in the whole society
I agree.
occupied region.
Yes, no, I agree. When I write, I try to be more, you know, specific. But sometimes when you think it's difficult you always use really the proper words. Sorry.
Thank you.
Okay, and then just pass the microphone.
Thanks to our CERI representative for an overview over what has happened in between what we used to call the East and the West since 1975. My reading of your lecture is that Russia has changed its stand on very many points and important issues in the second period of Putin's regime. I take a couple of examples. In the first, up to 2004, 2005, Putin, for instance, had the rule of law as one of his slogans for internal Russian affairs. And we would assume that that was also the case for his foreign policy. Now, since then, he has done nothing but break most international agreements since the Helsinki Accords of 1975, and for instance, not taking Russian troops out of Moldova in 2003 was also agreed. Secondly, I would mention that what you referred to briefly, namely that this modernization through rapprochement was something which we did not want to spell out for fear of promoting regime change.
Exactly.
Right. And now Putin has called our bluff. When you watch Russian TV, that is the main theme, or one of the main themes of his spokesman, namely that all the West wants is to get rid of the present regime in Russia. That's the point of sanctions. And as we all know, Nevada is still showing us that he has 85% or something like that support. Now, by the way, I don't trust Nevada anymore. Why should Nevada, as a public surveyor of opinion, have avoided all the government pressure that all the other sources of information from Russia has succumbed to, like TV stations and most breakers. But with Russia then having changed its stand on so many national and international issues, is there any wonder that the EU and all of us have problems how to tackle the new approach? And I share your pessimism. What is there for Putin in accepting peace in eastern Ukraine? I don't see very much motivation. Like you said, you did not either. And by the way, where would you place Norway in your northern crescent? You weren't too sure.
No, I was not.
We are not either, you see, that's the problem. So we have our problems as well, but we can live with those. It's worse when you have a big neighbor on your border, 196 kilometers, and you don't know what is going to be his next move. Is it enough to have two-language street signs in our northernmost city of Kirkenes, or is that still discrimination of the 7,000 or how many Russians are living up there? Thank you.
I'm going to try to be quick. First, a disclaimer. I think I made it clear in the beginning, I hope so, clear enough, that I'm not a Russia specialist, and I rely really upon Russian experts and Russian and non-Russian experts. Levada, Vladimir Milov was at our center the other day. I have also a Russian friend who comes and visit me sometimes, and both have and she's not interested in politics. Very interesting. She's really the normal Moscow middle class, right? So I have two different voices, same conclusion. In a sense, you can't trust Levada because people are not going to tell their mind. And she, for instance, this friend of mine tells me people are just, and the only thing they want to go is go abroad. And she's trying to settle down in the EU, right? Okay, that was the very small things. Change. I have a question here. I don't know if it matters or does not matter. In any case, I don't have the answer. But one very nice question would be, has Putin always been Putin and has Erdogan always been Erdogan? That kind of question. Or at one point of time, did they lose just, they got in the parallel world? What is interesting, in any case, there is a very good there are some very good books on Putin by Karin Darwisha, by Ben Judah. There is a very good film of MDR, Mitteldeutsches Radio, in German, on how Putin got rich. Started in the 1990s, very interesting. Anyway, so I don't know if Putin was always Putin or not, and what he changed, but in any case, I tried to make sure that some things were clear to you concerning the 1990s that never changed, in particular regarding the sovereignty of smaller neighbors. And another thing linked with that, which has never changed, so you have always the famous speech of Vladimir Putin, 2005. The greatest catastrophe of the 20th century was the end of the Soviet Union. He said the same thing just upon assuming power in 2000, I have the reference somewhere, but also in 1992. This is quoted by Timothy Garter Nash in an article he wrote in the New York Times in July, I guess probably 15th of July last year. Very interesting article speaking of the little gray mouse standing in there and saying, sternly standing up and saying the greatest catastrophe of, etc., etc. So I just want to go to the calling EU bluff, etc. What I find absolutely fascinating with Putin is the narrative he has managed to coin, to hammer out, putting together the fate of the demise of the Soviet Union, the explosion of the Soviet Union, and individual lives. I don't know if you have ever had to do with individuals. I'm sure, having lived in the Soviet Union, I happen to have several friends. I try to rearrange their curriculum vitae, right? I mean, dealing with their curriculum vitae, they had broken lives, doing this and that and that and that and that and that because of the story they went through. And then eventually I told them, you know what, you've got to explain people in the West that you lived through that. And this is the reason your career is not a career and it has changed. And these are people who still sort of made it. So imagine the poor little lady who goes to church in the Orthodox church in Tallinn. I went there, was fascinated by the little Russian lady there. I mean, waking up in a totally different country, totally shocked. I mean, and Putin managed in very many ways to conflate in these individual fates and the demise of the Soviet Union. And this is his absolute fantastic talent. He has spoken to the people, to all these people, right? And so I don't know if he called our bluff. We just did not understand. We did not understand, probably we might have not had the means to understand. We wanted to hear what we heard. He was very clever. I mean, after all, he was a KGB officer in Dresden. He addressed the Bundestag in, when was that, 2002, saying exactly what people wanted to hear. This was his education. I don't know if we could have done better, frankly. You know, there is a lot of EU bashing going on. I'm part of it. I'm very critical of the EU. But at one point of time, it must stop because it takes two to tango. And here, I mean, again, in this particular case, for instance, it must have been very difficult to try to figure out who was put in between 2000 and 2004, unless you have a very good intelligence or you wanted to be fooled. And there were people who wanted to be fooled. And in Germany, there were people who wanted to be fooled. We didn't speak much about Germany. Germany is a very specific country. And some people really want to be fooled in Germany.
Okay, final question.
Hello, Sonia Stojanovic-Gajic, Belgrade Center for Security Policy, also visiting research fellow here. I'll ask you a hypothetical question. If we imagine Ukrainian crisis was resolved and in a sort of way, satisfactory way, where do you see Russia playing its great powerhood? Because you said that was one of the mistakes of you taking it as a bigger Poland and not as something different. Where do you see in arenas where it could be a great power in a way which would be acceptable to you?
Then we are talking about a completely different world, because we are...
Exactly,
I would
wanted
start
here.
I'm starting with, you know, encirclement. I always have difficulties with the question of Russia being encircled. This is 11 time zone. This is the biggest country in the world. Who is encircling whom? Okay? This means dysfunctionality. It's very dysfunctional. If you are living in Vladivostok, you want to talk to people in Moscow, how do you do? When are you going to call? It starts with that. Okay, so I don't know if you can downsize the country, but I mean, downsizing apparently was not enough. But it would be reforming the whole economy, turning this country into a country which is economically viable and not relying on 30% of its natural resources. That would start with that, not having pockets of extreme wealth or wealth in Moscow, St. Petersburg, Nizhny Novgorod, in a couple of cities, but having really a functional, well-functioning state. That would be really power. You remember what was said at the time of communism? This is a developing country with nuclear weapons. I mean, it should start with developing itself. I'm not sure it's even a brick. So this is it. I have the impression I'm not answering the question because I'm not answering in terms of geopolitics. It should start doing cleaning its home economically, which means cleaning it in very many different ways. then it could become really something fantastic.
Why not offer membership in EU and NATO?
Membership in the EU, forget it. I mean, till Vladivostok, I mean, we have already a problem with our having 28 countries, right? No. I mean, we could have, in Turkey, etc., we could imagine a very specific kind of relationship. I don't know. I can't imagine it now. Member of NATO, why not? I don't know.
Okay, I see the time is running out, and that's a completely different topic as well. Thank you so much for this presentation and seminar, and also engaging in the discussion. I think that it's extremely important that your contribution today on spelling out the deeper history somehow of EU's relationship to Russia, and as you said also, it's easy to let go of the memory here and see some of the developments. And that's one important takeaway point for me at least. And the other observation that I have made is I found it very interesting the way you said that the EU somehow approached this bureaucratically and technically Ukraine, but at the same time, at some point, they started to see the strategic consequences, but it never trickled down to strategic policy.
Yes, exactly.
And that we have now this fundamental watershed, and there's basically no way around or no way back easily. And I think this is very important to keep in mind, and it would be you have to struggle with it. And then maybe, but that's if you want to go engage in some kind of talking now. At least we don't know if it's for real, but at least Russia is engaging a bit more systematically in creating their own alternative mode of integration. So,
except that they are neither Belarus nor Kazakhstan are applying sanctions from the West.
So if there is a talk shop somehow, maybe that's the EU-Eurasia discussion, but that's another topic. So thank you so much for joining us. Thank you so much for your well-put remarks and for the way you handle the questions as well. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's a very interesting question. I want to get